So, but I will start out asking you about your own ADHD diagnosis. I think you mentioned you were around 40, right? So kind of what was going on in your life? I know a lot of the women I interviewed were diagnosed because their kids were diagnosed. So I'm curious, is that how you
Yep,
came to your diagnosis?
kind of.
And
Yes
what,
and
what
no.
was going on and when was that?
But do you want me to answer that now? I can't tell.
Yeah.
Are we in it?
Yeah, sorry, we're starting now. I record the introduction later,
Got it.
separate from the actual interview. So yeah. Uh,
All good. All good. I just, oftentimes we'll start a conversation and somebody will be save that for the thing. I'm like, are we in the thing or not in the thing?
I know, right?
Um,
Yeah. No, we're on. We're going.
okay. So my story is very similar to what you described, which is, all of I often say my kids were diagnosed one after the other, like dominoes. And when the third one was not yet, but was clearly going to be diagnosed, I think. Um, I went to one of my kids' doctors, and I said, could this be me too? Like I looked around, I'm like, my husband can't be responsible for all of this neurology. There's just no way. Could this be me too? And I really got a pat on the head and a no, honey, you're just a mom.
Mm.
And so I, disregarded it, and I kept trying to function with three complex kids and a complex family and yada yada. And I was actually, what prompted it was I was going back to graduate school. And I decided, once I kind of got my head above water with managing these complex kids, I discovered coaching. Things were starting to turn around. We had had a nutritional change that really changed things in our family as well. And so things were starting to lighten. The load was starting to lighten. And I decided I needed to do something to help other parents, that nobody should go through alone what I went through those first 10 years, because it was horrible. And it looked great on the outside, but on the inside, I felt like a house of cards. And so decided I was going to go back to graduate school. I mean, I was trying to find a graduate program that met my schedule with three young kids. So, because I needed part-time, but I wanted it during the week and not the weekend. Like I couldn't find it. But so I knew I was on the path to get it to, I was going to go get a PhD or something. And so I went back and I had myself tested because I was wondering whether I needed accommodations.
Mm.
I started, because I'd done so much advocacy for my kids by this point, what I realized was that in college, like I had made it through prestigious university, I did really well in school, but I burned myself out. And so I started trying to figure out, why had I only written papers and never taken a test? Like, why did I like I didn't choose a major where I could ever have to take a test, even though I would have been fascinated by psychology. I couldn't do it. And so I went back and had myself evaluated, and I was diagnosed with attention and learning issues at, 40 something years old. And like you said, it was like all of a sudden my entire life made sense. Every job I had done, my major, my everything I had done started to get clear to me what had happened. So I picked up the phone and I called my mom on the way home, and I said, Mom, guess what we've got? And which really, really pissed off my dad for a while. And then I cried for a few months, because as you said, it really like rocked my world view of myself, because I was fairly high performing, high achieving, like, so something was incongruous. And I mean, this is going back a long time. I didn't know that much about ADHD in those days.
Yeah.
So yeah, so that's how it happened. It was kind of a combination of the kids, and I really wanted to go to graduate school. I ended up not going because I couldn't find a program that met my schedule. And so I discovered coaching. Somebody sent me to a coaching program. I'm like, okay, I'll do this as a stopgap measure. I'll do this for a year until I can find a graduate program. And the first afternoon I fell in love. I called my husband in tears. I'm like, this is it. I found it. And I hadn't thought about graduate school again until now. I'm thinking about it again, but it's a different conversation.
That's so funny. I have often wanted to go back and do graduate work, but my final year, I went to university. I'm from Canada, so we didn't have any standardized tests, thank God. And because I don't know what I would have done in that situation, but I was terrified to take the GREs. And
That was my
also,
stall.
right?
Because I went back and I took the GREs
Mm.
once I had the accommodations.
Oh, I had no idea, but I just remember like my final year of university, I got a job halfway through my year because I was wanted to get a new work at a newspaper. I got a newspaper job. I got my dream job. So therefore, there was no point in going to class at this point. And so I got Fs in every class in my last semester,
Right.
which brought tanked my GPA. But I thought, who cares? Doesn't matter. I've got my job. When am I ever going to think about my my degree ever again? Which now looking back, I'm like, yes, the signs were there all along.
Yeah,
Um,
always.
but yeah, it's so fascinating. So I sort of figured now, because I've often thought about, I also went through a coaching program, but I also have like really I've always sort of toyed with the idea of going back and getting a mental health counselor,
Yeah.
doing a mental health counselor graduate work. But I'm also kind of like, am I old enough now that they're not going to care about those flunks I got
Well,
in my 20s?
well, and so here was my theory. My theory was I'm in my 40s. All I need to do is break 1,000 on the GREs and I'll be able to talk my way in. That's what I figured. Like I don't know if I would ever not, but it was hard. And I really remembered why, like I haven't taken a math class since high school. So it was because I don't have, good facility with my working memory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I had self-accommodated in college in ways I didn't really understand until later. But
Yeah.
literally never took a class that required a test after my freshman year of college.
I mean, it amazes me that I was very lucky because I did not come to ADHD through my children. I came to ADHD through my therapist who has
Wow.
ADHD. She came to her ADHD through her son, but she noticed in me, I've been seeing her for years, and she was gently suggesting to me, like, you should
Right.
look into this because she noticed this like wide, chasm between how I was performing and what I was doing and interested in, and taking on jobs and entrepreneurial manic interest in things, and then my self-worth,
Worth.
like my
Yes.
narrative. And she was noticing this great divide, and I thought, well, no, I'm probably bipolar because I would recognize that manic swing of the pendulum, which what I now realize is sort of the hyper focus and then the burnout, phase. But at the time, she was like, "You should look into ADHD," and I was like many women, I was like, "No, I've been diagnosed with depression and anxiety. I'm not hyper. I can literally spend days on the couch."
Yeah.
And so I
Well,
didn't
and I
really
was
have that.
diagnosed with and treated for anxiety for years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right, for many years. And when I got treated for ADHD, it's amazing how much less anxiety there was. And I don't
Right.
mean that it's gone by any stretch, but so much of the anxiety was I can't get myself to do what everybody expects me to do, and I expect myself to do. It makes you anxious.
Right, what's wrong with me? Yeah.
Yeah.
And I remember my daughter, she's now in high school, but when she was in the third grade, she was really struggling with this huge project. It was like the first time in her life that she had a really big project where she had to do a lot of research, and then kind of had to then translate this research into sections and paragraphs and essays
Did
on
you
this,
say third grade?
third grade. She was doing a project on Singapore. And
That's
so
so
she had
wrong.
done all of this research, but then it was like, okay, now what do we do? Where do we start? And she just like froze. She couldn't start. And I remember so viscerally at that time, this was long before my ADHD diagnosis, before I had any idea what was happening. I related so deeply to that paralysis, right? Where I was like, this
Yeah.
is what happened to me in school all the time. I was like, Catherine Ellison, who I
Ellison,
interview, as she
Kathy.
said, stuck on input, which just like, yeah, describes my entire academic, right?
Yeah.
My entire academic career, which was like, I loved research, I loved reading, I loved bringing ideas together. But when it came to actually having to like write the essay or have the test, I just was like, bleh, like I just couldn't do it. I'd get so overwhelmed. And so I was watching my third grader have that same issue. And I remember thinking back then, like, I had an undiagnosed learning disorder. Something was happening and I didn't get the help I needed. But then, even then, it still took years before I really kind of understood what ADHD was and how what executive functioning was.
And the interweaving of it all, because
Mhm.
it's probably not just ADHD, right? I know it wasn't for me, it wasn't for my kids. And it was all it was intertwined. So for me, I couldn't take tests, but I could write anything.
Mhm.
And I really learned to write. So I leaned into that strength and played to that strength, because with writing, I didn't have to hold the information in my head. I could write it down, I could capture it,
Right.
and then I could use it. So I didn't have to remember it. Whereas with a test, you're supposed to remember stuff. So like I literally ran out of my SATs in the middle of the SATs because I was so stressed out and got sick in high school from being so stressed out from test anxiety.
Wow.
But I could write anything. And so I just gravitated to what worked for me,
That's so
in
amazing.
so many ways. Yeah.
Okay. So you discovered coaching, which is great. And I love that. I love that story too of the, sort of the subtle difference between coaching and therapy and kind of, exploring
Well,
that.
therapy, I in those days, I thought therapy is established. It's a credential. I grew up in what I call the achievement elite,
Mhm.
right? You're expected to go to college, you're expected to get a graduate degree. And I always thought I would get a graduate degree. I didn't expect to burn myself out in college. And so for me, the gold standard was an academic degree. That's what you had to do. And then when I discovered coaching and I realized that coaching reflected everything I stood for, it was about empowerment and about conscious change and people being at choice and possibility. And it was like, it wasn't saying you're broken, let's fix you. It was saying, you're phenomenal. What do you want to do? How do you want to get there? Like, it was just everything I needed. And it quickly became very clear that it was everything my kids needed. That my kids needed me to stop looking at that performance paradigm that says, well, you're struggling in math, so we need to get you a math tutor. And they needed me to start saying, look how gifted you are in storytelling or in math or whatever it is. Let's play to that. Let's really enhance that. And oh, by the way, we'll get you some support in math. Don't worry about that. Nobody has to be great at everything. And that's the shift. And it was profoundly impactful for me and for my kids. And within a couple of years, my husband came on board and he actually became a coach too. And then a couple of years later, I asked him, what changed? What happened? He said, I just couldn't deny anymore that what you were doing was working. And it was, and I wasn't coaching my kids. I was just changing my approach to how I communicated with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like I've talked about this in other interviews in the past, but one thing that I really think a lot about, as we do, going sort of over our life through with this fine-tooth comb and looking at all these ways in which we could have, the grief about like the signs were there, why was nobody noticing?
Yeah.
And so I am the youngest. I have two older brothers who did very well academically, Ivy League scholarships, and I started struggling in middle school and just never recovered. So I had a very dismal academic career. And had a lot of F's in high school, barely graduated, had to redo my senior year, a lot of that. So I really struggled. And I remember my parents always saying like, well, we can't all have, all of our kids can't be A students. You're just, you're the one who has the street smarts, not the book smarts. Right. And they were like very quick to kind of label. And they always had this joke where I was in the gifted program also. Not
right,
surprisingly.
It's not like you weren't smart, right?
Right. And I like 2E kids, I sort of had that feeling of like, they're gonna kick me out any moment, right? They're gonna find me out. And why haven't they kicked me out yet? Right. Yeah. And so my parents would always joke about the fact that they were like, of our 3 kids, you have the highest IQ, but look at you, like you're a hot mess, right? Isn't this funny? And so for them, like I see the way in which they like kind of labeled their three children, right?
Yes.
And now looking back, I think that that was actually quite damaging. Like I feel like I needed help, and to just, I think at the time, I think they did the best that they could, obviously, and they were really trying to say, look, academics are not important to us. We don't care. Like we just want you to be good at something that moves
That you
you.
feel good
And
about.
I think,
Yeah.
like I think, you know, looking back at my life, that's really mattered. But in terms of like my self-worth, and in terms of my sense of intelligence,
Yeah.
I really struggled with that because I did so poorly in academia. And so I think about that with my kids now all the time. I have a 15-year-old and a 10-year-old. So a ninth grader and a fifth grader. And, you know, like, I don't know, like rather than thinking, you know, with my son, especially my fifth grader, you know, I'm like, I don't know whether which approach to take, because on the one hand I feel like I don't want to be the parent who says you have to get all A's. My daughter gets all A's, it's very easy to her. With my son, he really is very interest driven, and so, you know, I know that he can do well in some of these subjects, and I know that it would be important to him to do well, like in terms of his sense of self. But at the same time, I think about what my parents did and how like that didn't work either. And so I'm
Yeah.
always sort of feeling like, you know, that that sense, you know, that questioning, like, am I going to screw up my kid? Well, I am.
Yes.
No problem.
Right. No question. Good parenting is damage control. Just did that podcast episode.
Right. Right.
Right.
But again, sort of feeling like, how would I, you know, so much of parenting is kind of like, how do I redo my own childhood? Right. And I think that can be, I think it has pros and cons.
I think it's a huge part of the work that I do, actually, is, and I've become aware of this in the last few years, of how many parents I work with who are trying to change the paradigm, break the cycle, figure out how do I not dishonor what my parents did, or let go of what my parents did, depending on what that was, and still be the parent this kid needs. You know, like exactly what you're speaking to. And as we were talking, two thoughts came up. One was that same experience I had of, I thought I was probably, everybody kept telling me I was smart, but they were probably wrong, because it was so hard for me.
Mm-hmm.
And in eighth grade, I even asked my mom, I said, I think I'm going crazy and I need some help. And so my mom took me to this therapist, and I sat across the big brown table from this old white guy who, after an hour, looked at my mother and said, she's fine. And they sent me on my way. And that was it. Right. I had asked, like, I knew there was something, and I just didn't know how to label it. My mom tried. She was told professionally, I'm fine. And so we went on. But that nagging feeling of, they think I'm smart, but they just don't know the truth yet, was always there all the way along into college and through college. So when my kids came along, and my eldest was brilliant and really struggled with school, like super, super difficult struggle. And I probably made a lot of the same mistakes you've spoken to, that are now beginning to surface now in those first 10 years. But what I used to say to them was, you're going to be an amazing adult, and we just got to get you there. And being a kid is hard, and being a teenager is really hard. And we're going to get you there because you're going to be an amazing adult. And when I work with parents now, the conversation, the way I began to shift it, the difference between my eldest and my youngest is about 6-7 years. And by the time my youngest was coming up into elementary years, I was a coach and I was doing this work. And so the difference of their self-concept is quite vivid, right? And with the youngest, I started the conversations like, well, what's important to you about your education? And, you know, how do you see yourself? And instead of, man, you know, you're getting C's in this, and, you know, you could be doing A work, I would say things like, well, how important is it to you? And which classes do you think you want to be doing well in? And I really took that coach approach, so that when he owns it, he really owns it. And when he knows he's got to do the work, he's just like, he was not going to get A's in chemistry in high school, even though he probably could have, because he just didn't care enough. But getting him to buy in to do it at all for his own benefit, that was an accomplishment, right? So that was how I dealt with it later. I did not do it as well earlier as I did later.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. We talk about that a lot, my husband and I, of sort of, his albatross with my daughter especially is her messy room. And it's it's what
Yeah,
is going
it's
to
her
tear them
room.
apart. I mean, it's,
She's 15.
exactly. Well, that's
You
the
want to know
sort
what
of
our rule was? You can share this with your husband. Our rule was this: if you would like me to say goodnight to you or to wake you up in the morning, you will clear a path between the door and the bed so that I don't kill myself.
Well, that's what
That
he
was
says
it.
to me. He says, "Have you seen her room?" And I'm like, "No, of course not. I don't go in there.
Why
I'm
would
not.
you go in
Why
there?
would I do that to myself?" But we talk a lot about the why, right? Which is, both of my children have to like really understand the why behind any task. And it's our job to help them find that, it might be
But
self-evident
it's their
in
why,
adulthood. Right.
not
Exactly.
your why. Right. And
Right.
that's the
And
shift.
yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think about that a lot in terms of, trying to explain to my husband that things are not necessarily self-evident in childhood, right? And especially with neurodivergent children. Now,
Is
that's
he
another thing.
neurotypical?
He is. He is. This is something I question all the time. I mean, I'm fairly newly diagnosed, so I'm like, I had to go through and I'm looking through my family tree and I'm looking at my children. Neither of my children are officially diagnosed. It's been such a crazy pandemic, and
Yeah.
I also feel like neither of them is very stereotypically ADHD in their behaviors, and so I want to be really, really careful when they are tested. Because they have a lot of anxiety, but they really, really want to do well, and that anxiety kind of trumps the hyperactivity element of the misbehaving in school.
I think you have to treat the clearest, most presenting factor.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, and sometimes it's anxiety and sometimes it's the ADD and sometimes it's the working, like you have to deal with what's showing up.
Yeah. Yeah. And exactly, I sort of feel like as my understanding of myself grows, it's affecting my parenting
Right.
tremendously. And
Yeah.
so that's something I know you talk about, which is, getting, dealing with your own issues is kind of, the idea that, I guess that idea that you can't pour from an empty cup, but
Well,
bringing it toward just understanding what is happening as a parent, you can then help them in their
yeah,
own life.
some of it is that empty cup, right? You got to take care of yourself, self-care. I know it's not just words, it's so essential. And some of it is you got to do your work. Like a lot of parenting these complex kids, and whether the parents that I'm playing with in my sandbox are neurotypical or not, they're all doing some really deep, difficult work, because to parent these kids effectively, we have to get ourselves out of the way. And when we're trying to deal with their stuff and it's really our stuff, we're not really serving our kids to help them deal with their stuff. So if we're I'm thinking about this one mom of an adopted kid, and she and her husband, single kid, she and her husband are both neurotypical kids, like textbook ADD, 15-year-old. And she's doing real work to begin to think about how do you shift your expectations without lowering them, and how do you meet him where he is and empower him to become the kid he has the capacity to be, and still hold a bar for his success without setting it so high that he can't hit it. I mean, that's a lot of work.
Mm-hmm.
And to do that work, you got to let go of the stuff that you're taking personally, and you got to get out of your own way. And you can't make it be about you as a parent. Like, no offense to your husband, but your daughter's room is his issue, not hers. Right. And in my world, like what is important, because it's not an unreasonable value that he wants his daughter to clean her room, but for the sake of what, and what's that conversation look like, and what's it costing him in terms of relationship, and like that's some heavy work to do, right?
Yeah. Oh, I know. It's a conversation we have a lot, because I sort of feel like, his point of view is, I have the answers and I can show her the answers if only she
Right.
will listen. And isn't that my job as a parent? And my point of view is always, you're already showing her the answers just by modeling this
Modeling it.
behavior. So when she has her own apartment and it actually becomes important for her to like not get rodents or whatever it is that she needs to look after, she will have had that behavior modeled for her when it becomes necessary.
And as they become teenagers, it has to do with how they accept the information, right? So if you
Mhm.
tell somebody, they will consider it. If you ask them in a way that they answer it for themselves, then they will own it and it will be theirs.
Mm.
And they will act on it differently than if you tell them. So we always say ask, don't tell, because as soon as you tell them, particularly over the age of 12, you've lost them, right? They're not listening, really. I mean, you can tell them and they'll nod and they'll say, yeah, 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 but they're not going to own it in the same way
Mhm.
as if you involve them in it.
Yeah. No, it's so true. I'm just thinking, I'm smiling because I was thinking about, I think it was in one of your earlier podcast episodes, which I absolutely love. So I'm so glad you guys are doing that.
Thank
I
you.
hope you're having fun with it. It
We
sounds like
really
you are.
are. Yeah, we really are. Long overdue. It took years to get to it.
Yeah, it's you got other
Yeah.
things on your plate. But yeah, I think you were talking about like books and how you can only read so many books when you're a parent, and you can get stuck on input, right? Where it's like
Yeah.
you can start to read books, but really what you need is the hand holding. You need, you call it a Sherpa, which I love because I use that term all the time in parenting, where I'm like carrying everything out from the car, and I was like, I'm basically just a Sherpa. But
Yeah.
and it reminded me of when my daughter was 2 or 3 and I read the parenting book, How to Talk So Your Kids Will Listen and Listen So Your
Yes.
Kids Will Talk. Great book.
Yep.
I don't remember anything from that book, but I do remember, one of the things they emphasized was when your child, not to be so quick to answer your child, not to give them the information, but to ask them, what do you think? And I remember like this moment when she had asked me a question and I don't remember what it was, but she had asked me this question and I was like, well, what do you think? And she just looked at me point blank and was like, I don't know, Mom. That's why I'm
I'm
asking
asking
you.
you.
And I just sort of froze because I was like, what comes next? What comes next in the book? I don't remember. Hold on? But it just reminded me of that feeling as a parent often, right? Where you're kind of a deer caught in headlights, where you're like, it doesn't matter how many Dr. Sears books you read or anything. Like at the end of the day, you really are just flying by the seat of your pants. And you get so much of parenting is sort of trusting your gut and just doing the thing in the moment.
Well, and that's why I wrote the Essential Guide, was because what I wanted was a parenting book for those of us whose kids are not so typical, right? That book that doesn't tell you what to do, but gives you kind of a mindset, like what I want for parents is like, I've got this, bring it on, whatever you got, I can handle it, I can swing at it, I can, like, I've got this. And I think that comes more with a parenting paradigm, with a framework or an understanding of how do I want to be as a parent, rather than when she says this, you say that, or when you do that. Like, I think the more tactical you get with suggestions in some ways, the less helpful they can be.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean that they're not sometimes helpful. I mean, strategies can be really useful, but mostly as parents come to us looking for strategies, right? And it's very hard for them to get their head around what we're saying to them, which is, hang on, we promise we'll get you to the strategies, but give us a minute to help you understand a framework first. Because if you can understand the framework of empowerment, for lack of a better word, if you can understand, take aim on one thing at a time and don't try to do so many things, if you can get the foundation in place, then you don't have to think at 5 o'clock when your daughter's asking you a question and the water's boiling over, and like you own. It's kind of like, did you ever do yoga?
Oh yeah.
Okay. So, when you first start doing yoga, it's very conscious and you breathe in, you pause, exhale. And then over time, after you've been doing it for a while, when something happens, you automatically go to your breath. You use the breath to calm yourself down in your life, whatever you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of like that. It's like, what I want is for the coach approach for parents to be their breath, their exhale, how they approach everything without having to think about it.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think also one thing that has helped me tremendously since my diagnosis is being able to explain what is happening. Like
Yes.
I've always, for me, it's always about repair, right? I've never, and that's one thing I think I really am grateful for my ADHD, which is like rage. Yes, it totally overstimulation. Yes, I had no idea what was happening for years. Now that I have the language and the toolbox, it's really helped me to be able to explain to my children what is happening in the moment
Yeah.
when there is the repair. And I've never been the kind of parent who's like, because I said so. Um, but just being able to have that language to say like,
Hmm.
I'm really sorry. I went from zero to yelling, but this was the TV, the dog, all this stuff was happening. And that is why. And so it's been really helpful for me to have that language personally that I can then, you know, turn and explain to them,
Yeah.
why the why behind any decisions, really.
Well, and that's what I love about diagnosis is that for us or for our kids, I'm a big believer in diagnosis because I think it gives you an explanation for what's going on that you can then learn to navigate. And without it, what we make up about ourselves or what our kids make up about themselves is a whole lot uglier. They make up they're lazy, crazy, or stupid when the truth is they're irritated or irritable or tired or hungry or whatever it is. And when you can, I'm thinking about, we have a code word in our family for when someone gets so hungry they just need to stop and eat, right? It's called broccoli ice cream. And we started it really, really young, and they still use it. They're now all young adults, but that's that noticing, that awareness of, I'm not functioning anymore because I'm hungry, and
Mhm.
that's not helpful for anybody, and I've got to stop now and take care of that. And everybody acknowledges it and honors it, and like, that awareness that you're speaking to is so powerful. It's just understanding yourself just a little bit, that next layer, right?
Mhm. Yeah, and sort of it's basically you're looking for the accommodations that you need in that moment, right? Like I think that was another thing when I was talking about my son and doing with his schoolwork, and not wanting to pressure him to get all A's, but at the same time knowing that like he's capable of the A's, and if he gets the A's, he will feel so much better about himself. And I used to, before my diagnosis, because he was in very early elementary school, but he struggled. He wasn't verbal for a long time. He was always kind of had an IEP and was delayed. And so my thinking was always like, well, not all of, just like my parents, not all of my kids are going to get straight A's. And now I've really sort of shifted to like, what accommodations do we need? Like what do you need to get the A? And like, I don't necessarily,
It's not about the A. I
it's not
get it.
about the A, but again, it's sort of like, what do you need in this moment to be your best self?
Well, so here's what
Sometimes
comes
it's
up as you're
broccoli ice
saying
cream.
that. Sometimes it's broccoli. I have a client I was working with this week who's got a kid, teenage 13, 14-year-old boy, who's got 6 classes and has really made a lot of progress in the last year, is doing great. And the kids got 4 A's and 2, barely passing. And the parents were like asking the question, I want him to take responsibility for all of his education. I want him to get, he can do straight A's. It's like, okay, let's look at what's really important to him. Clearly, he's got ownership, or he wouldn't have those 4 A's. So, what's going on with these other 2 classes? And so, they were both language arts and history. They're writing, there's all this executive function. Like, as we broke it down to see what was really happening, they can then go back to him and have a conversation to help the kid decide, okay, what if I were to get some support or work or whatever, would I be able to pull it up to a B? Is that important to me? What's and so, because the kids got ownership. And so it's not about can he hear or not. It's about, is it important enough, and what's the benefit and the cost to him? And
Right.
even at 10 years old, I think you can start having those conversations in some way to engage them to a sense of choice about themselves and their education,
Mhm.
especially in this environment.
Yeah, it's been really interesting having these last 2 years of hybrid learning and remote learning. And I don't know, I'm sure a lot of parents have had a, a real window into how their children, um,
Learn.
learn in a
Yeah.
way that we never were afforded, for better or for worse.
Yeah.
Not necessarily, there was a lot that was terrible about having to suddenly become their teacher and their mother and everything else and housekeeper. But, it really gave me such insight into both my children's, like you said, like where the stakes are and what they're interested in. And
I was thinking about it yesterday. I think that, we've spent 2 years, I was joking, streaming Netflix and cortisol, right? Basically. And for those of you who don't know, cortisol is a stress hormone. So that's basically what we've had for going on 2 years. And we've got kids with developmental delays that are now being compounded by a universal systemic developmental delay. Because even if they're doing okay in school right now, I mean, we've got kids going off to college, coming home, and they just are not developing as much as kids would typically do. They're not getting the same interaction. I've got a client who's a college professor who says she's having conversations with students she's never had before in all these years because they don't have access to the upperclassmen they usually get to talk to. Right. And so same with high school, kids are not getting as much exposure to other kids and older kids. And so you've got this kind of systemic developmental delay that's happening on top of these kids who have their own individual developmental delays. And I think it's going to be years before we see that unfold a little bit. We see the real impact of it. But I think we're going to have to shift our expectations to meet them for where they are now, not what we thought would typically be developing. There's not going to be any alternative, really.
Right. And to stop convincing them that they are somehow behind right now.
Right. This notion that anyone is behind is absurd to me.
Yeah.
Because we're all behind. Or maybe not. Maybe we're not behind anything. Maybe this is right where we are. Right.
So I'm curious about the term complex, because, it's not what I've heard. I talk about neurodivergent or 2E. So how did you come up with the term complex? Because for me, it feels like every child is complex. So like, what is that umbrella?
Well, it's because you have complex kids.
That's true. Nothing is easy.
So the really simple version is kids who struggle with some aspect of life or learning. But what happened for me when I started this world was I had one kid with like 8 or 10 diagnoses. All of my kids have a minimum of 2 or 3 diagnoses, myself included, and my husband. And when Diane and I first started, it used to be Impact ADHD before we became ImpactParents. And I kept wanting to branch out because we knew it was never just about ADHD. And parents would come to us and say, well, my kid doesn't have ADHD, so I can't use your help. I'm like, yeah, you can, I promise. It's really not about ADHD. It's about, and so when I started doing the research and I realized about 86% of kids with one diagnosis have multiple diagnoses, and the term special needs didn't really feel like it applied, because when I came up and when my kids were little, special needs still had this otherness stigma to it. And I didn't feel comfortable calling my kids special needs because they didn't have physical disabilities. And so I just was looking for something that made more sense, because ADHD was just not enough. And I don't know, I just landed on, these are complex, and people started responding to it. So when I wrote the most recent book, and the publishers didn't want anything to do with it because it didn't specifically say either ADHD or anxiety, or, didn't have
Interesting,
because they want to be able to market it clearly. And so we kind of compromised on the Essential Guide to Raising Complex Kids with ADHD, anxiety, and more. Right. And so, and I wanted it to be ADHD, anxiety, autism, depression. I wanted to list out 30 things. They wouldn't let me do that either. But I think that what I've often said is, if you have a complex kid, you know exactly what I mean. And if you don't, then it's not for you anyway.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, right. For sure. Well, and this is something I felt so naive when I received my ADHD diagnosis, because not only did I have my therapist kind of hand holding me, but I had a very, very knowledgeable, mental health specializing NP who, I came to her with all my paperwork in a flurry. Nice. And she was like, yeah, you had me at hello. It's totally, right. Yes. I was not met with any kind of gaslighting or gatekeeping the way I hear other women experiencing, and I mean, granted, I was diagnosed with depression and anxiety. So there were a lot of people I was seeing who had no idea that this was ADHD, including myself. But it amazes me how many women are told you're just depressed or you're just anxious, and that medical professionals are not making those connections, between like, you can't, it's coming from somewhere, it's coming from being undiagnosed. And that there is not, it's pathologizing depression and anxiety in this way, I think can be really um, damaging to somebody who just feels like these diagnoses are not fitting. There's got to be something else going on here, et cetera, et cetera. But like, it still is just like, I've lost track of how many women are said, well, are turned away from their doctors because they're looking up, they're reading about ADHD. They're feeling like, oh my goodness, this is explaining so much about so many things I have struggled with throughout my entire life. And then going to a doctor and the doctor saying, well, no, you've outgrown it. Or, adults don't have ADHD, or, you can't possibly have ADHD because you did well in school, or like all of these ways in which.
Heard them all. Yeah. So here's what I would say is that I think I would invite us to take a historical view, right? So in 1991, I think it was, Sari Solden came out with the first book on ADHD in women and changed the landscape. It was, that was only 30 years ago when we said out loud, women can have ADHD. And then, somebody's been pitching me to be on some podcast that's like, ADHD doesn't exist. Like, I'm not playing this game. And they sent me this video from 1995 and saying, it's every bit as accurate as it was then. I'm like, no, in fact, there's been a ton of research done in the last 30 years. And we know so much more. Just in the last 10 years, we know so much more than we did. And most of our practitioners don't get this education. Like, you and I are super well informed because we've done a lot of work to get informed. But most of our practitioners, and I'm not dismissing them for it, it either wasn't part of their education or they were educated before. Like, I had a medical student who called me this year in the last couple of months, and she said, I am seeing so much ADHD in this population. I'm working in a clinic. She's in a residential community in Florida. And she said, these parents need something and nobody's getting it. And it's not in my med school curriculum. Will you do a webinar for my medical school class? Because nobody's teaching it. So the doctors aren't getting it and the therapists aren't getting it. And or they didn't get it. I'm hopeful that they're going to start getting it in the coming years, but it takes 20 years for research to get into practice.
Yeah.
And so we're kind of caught in this stage right now.
Well, and it's also fascinating too, because I think, there's a lot of question around why has there been such an increase in diagnoses since the beginning of the pandemic, right? And I'm always asking that question too, right? Which
Parents
is like,
are seeing it.
Yeah, well, and I had an emotional breakdown. That's what happened to me. My kids were home. My husband was home. I was remote learning. I was the housekeeper all of a sudden. I couldn't do my own job. I was basically just sitting there waiting for the next crisis to happen on Zoom. And I was miserable. And that's where I realized, okay, I can't do any, like I couldn't even, it had all come to a head. And so I've spoken to many mothers, especially who came to their ADHD through, just the house of cards just blowing right off the table after the pandemic.
Yeah. And that third kid put me over the edge.
Right. Exactly. So there's always, and same with like having a baby and like realizing now how much I struggled with what was just labeled postpartum depression or postpartum anxiety. But now I'm like, oh no, it was lack of sleep and crying and all of the other stuff and hormones. And
well, and I think I could handle it. I accommodated for myself when it was just me. When I was only responsible for me, and I could work more hours if that's what it took, and I could do whatever I needed to do to manage my life to be successful for myself and my life. It wasn't until I had kids that I needed that there was this different level of accountability, and I could no longer just accommodate for myself because there were other parameters I had to hit.
Yeah, that's such a good point. So it's funny to me because I feel like here is this, this diagnosis that is misunderstood in women. And then at the same time, you're also hearing the dismissive, like, oh, everybody has ADHD right now. It's so trendy. ADHD is overdiagnosed. And and it's like you're going back and forth between these two ways in which you realize like it's just bringing to the fore how much women are dismissed, right? And how much gaslighting there is around struggle as a woman, right? And how much that, we internalize all of that messages of like, well, you just can't get your shit together, you just got to keep trying, or whatever it is, right? That we've been hearing our whole lives.
So many things I want to say. You just said so many things. One of them is I have a podcast guest for you. So there's a brand new book called Emotional Labor. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but A Woman's Work Is Never Done. I'll introduce you to her.
Awesome.
And it's with Judith Kohlberg, and a good friend of mine whose name I am completely blanking on, and I will come back to it. And so definitely for that conversation. But this notion that somehow we as women should just be able to handle everything that comes, and that we shouldn't have any struggle. And if we did, there's something wrong with us because we're struggling. It's that in and of itself is pathological, right? That's just so wrong on so many levels. And I just feel like we buy into it. We've all bought into it on some level. This notion that we're supposed to be good girls, pleasers, perfect, make it work for everybody else. And, we turn out to be just as human as everybody else, just as riddled with challenges and foibles and capacity to do great things and also to struggle through it. And we need each other to support each other in it, because it's not going to just be handed. We have to ask for what we want. We have to do it without apology. I think you were talking about the stigma around ADHD. And one of the things I've really noticed in the last 10 years is, as we've seen the autism movement rise to the surface so profoundly in the last 20 years, when you look at those two diagnoses side by side from a public perception perspective, right? You've got one that's a diagnosis of stigma and shame and judgment. You have another that started off as shame and has morphed to a diagnosis of concern and care. And, I don't need to tell you which is which. We are still stuck in stigma and shame around ADHD. And I have a mom who has a kid who's diagnosed with several issues on the spectrum. Kid is now come out as trans. She said she's getting so much more support from her community for the kid coming out as trans than she ever did with the kid because of the ADHD.
Really
unbelievable.
Yeah.
And so we've got this stigma around it that's compounding. It doesn't matter, because there's all this good research on whether it's overdiagnosed or underdiagnosed or overmedicated or undermedicated. And we're beginning to see that it's the quote overmedication is not quite the problem we thought it was in quite the same way. But I think it's because we're still allowing that stigma to dominate the conversation. And as a parent, it's still an ADHD diagnosis still comes out as, well, if you would just discipline them, there wouldn't be a problem. Whereas you look at something like an autism diagnosis or a learning disability diagnosis, like, oh, we can help you with that. We could do something about that, because it's more learnable, right? It's more skill-based repair, if you will.
Well, and that's what I love so much about Sari Solden's work too, is that, rather than focusing on here's how we're going to fix everything, she's like, let's deal with the internalized stigma and the messages that have been told to us our entire lives and just blow the roof off of those, because that's right. Really what is happening here, which is like, we believe if I could just do the thing, everything would be fine. Like, we have internalized those messages and we need to stop thinking that is true, and really just being like, of course you don't want to do the dishes. Who wants to do the dishes? Like all of these ways in which
or what is it about the dishes you want
right?
to do?
Yeah.
Like,
I
you
mean,
want
they
to
still have to get
bar.
done. Yeah. But they still have to get done, but at least giving yourself permission to not be a domestic goddess or to be all
Right.
of the things. Right. Which brings us
Yeah.
back to that emphasis on consistency with grades. Right.
It,
But that's a whole
it's
other
all
topic.
connected.
I know.
Well,
Right.
and I don't want to leave this conversation without also plugging Michelle and Sari's workbook that they came out with a couple of years ago.
Yes,
because
absolutely.
it's the Radical Women's Guide, I guess is what it's called. And it's
Mhm.
just, it's a fabulous way for women to begin to deal with some of those demons and readdress the assumptions. Positive intelligence is another great way to do that. We don't teach it. We run the positive intelligence program in our community several times a year so that parents can really challenge the saboteur voices that we all have, right?
Oh my goodness. I can't believe how time has flown. I feel like I have so much I still want to ask you. I do always ask my guests if you could rename ADHD to something else. Would you call it something else? Which
Oh,
I
God,
have no
yes.
answer for. But yeah.
There's so many things I would call it. So many. I don't have a pithy name. Now I will come up with one at some point. But almost anything would be better than attention deficit disorder, except for what it was before that, which was minimal brain dysfunction. So that one was pretty bad too. So, relatively speaking, from a historical perspective, it's better. Now I think it's not about deficit.
Right.
It's a self-regulation. It's a brain regulation condition. You know, I liked the work early on. Tom Hartman used to do some work on that whole hunter-gatherer versus the
farmer. Yeah.
Right. And there's something about the way that we're wired that is exciting and interesting and creative and can be challenging in typical society. But I think we should call ourselves the stimulation seekers. That's what I'm going to land on
I like
today.
That one. I like alliteration too. Always a fan.
Yeah.
Speaking of alliteration, let's talk about, we didn't get to talk too much about ImpactParents, but I will definitely put a link to it. I'll talk about it in the introduction because I know I really want to hype your fantastic podcast and all the work you're doing and the books Sanity School, is that something that's still going on?
I was going to say, can we just talk real quick about Sanity School?
Yeah, I want to hear what you and Diane are doing for 2022 and how people can find you and get more of you.
So thank you. So ImpactParents will give you a free download to put in the show notes so that people can come get some free stuff, because we do a lot of free stuff. I'd say about 95% of what we do is free. And then, we use fee-based programs to pay for all of the free stuff that we do. And even in that, we really, our value is that we know that it's effective. So we want to make it affordable and accessible. So everything we do, we make that effort. And so what we do is a combination of coaching, training, and support. And the secret to what we do is we're actually teaching coaching skills. So Sanity School is a foundational training. It's a behavior therapy training program for parents, which is recommended treatment for kids with ADHD and other executive function issues. And so the treatment recommendation is that if the kid has the issue, actually the parent's the one that needs the training, because the parent's the one that's creating the environment and setting the expectations and empowering the positivity, et cetera. So Sanity School is a 6-class course that's a training in this coach approach to behavior management, basically. And we'd been working together for about 5 years when we realized we were doing all this coaching and our parents in our community needed a basic training. And so we created Sanity School in 2015 as a way to provide that foundation to save time and money so they could get the training and then use it in the coaching. And so it's available always on demand, and then we teach it every so often as well. But when you get it on demand, it comes with 3 months of support and access to us and all kinds of in a community. So it's not as passive as it sounds like it is. But it is, to me, it's like the best thing that any parent can do if your kid's diagnosed with anything or you think they're going to be, because it helps you get your head around it. Right? Set that framework for how do I parent this kid before you start getting into the details of it, because the details are going to be important.
Mhm.
but getting your head in the game first, I think, is really powerful. So that's what Sanity School is about.
Yeah.
And then what we're doing this year, last year in the pandemic, we started offering short courses. So we're now doing a series of 4-week courses. And we have some coaches we've trained and brought into our community. And so they're going to be offering some this year. So that for parents who want a live experience, but don't want a long-term commitment, we do have, long-term coaching groups, but people can come in for a month at a time and get some support, which has been really great.
And so that's all under the umbrella of the online community, which
Everything at Impact Parents, there's a programs page and everything,
right.
one way or another. And then, as I say, there's lots of free webinars and free ways to get in and get a sense of what we do. But in terms of programming, it's a combination of training and coaching, basically. And then everything has a support component.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We love what we do. We feel really lucky. We do.
I know it is incredible. I've learned so much about how I learn too, which I think has been really interesting since my diagnosis, because I had such, I had such self-esteem issues when it came to my own intelligence because I performed so dismally in academia. Right. And so it's been really interesting for me to be able to kind of be okay with how I learn. And I think for so many of us, how we learn about our ADHD is through conversation and through shared lived experience. And it's not necessarily going to be found in the DSM, or even, it's by sharing and realizing, oh, I'm not the only one. There's other people. This is incredible.
And what we really pay attention to is to make sure that it's multimodal, so that, that you can watch it, or you can listen to it, or you can read it, or you can talk about it, or you can, like, now we've started discussion groups, like it doesn't matter what your mode of learning and processing is, you should be able to do it. And so everything that we do, we try to design it so that however you process information, we can help you process the information, right?
I love
because
that.
There's no stigma that you should be able to do it a certain way. It just doesn't work that way. And Diane and I process very differently, so that helps a lot.
Yeah, I actually didn't know that Diane did not have ADHD until I heard that in your podcast. I was like, oh, interesting. No. Because for me, that's the other thing. I'm so immersed in it. I'm like, doesn't everybody who's interesting have ADHD? But interesting, as a side note, when I was listening to the Radical workbook, the Radical Guide for Women with ADHD, I was listening to it as an audiobook, and I kept thinking, like, wow, it'll be really helpful if I filled out these, discovery and reflection sections, but I would never do that on my own. I just don't have the patience to do it. So I started a book club where I was like, let's do it together, where we actually sort of body double and fill out the reflections together. And it's actually tonight is the first night we're starting it. But so I was like, oh, I have to be really prepared for this. So I should fill these out ahead of time. And I still can't fill them out. And I realized I'm never going to fill these out. I'm only going to talk about them because I process verbally. Like, I just can't write it down, no matter how much time or effort I give it.
I'm so with you. So we have a workbook that comes from Sanity School. And what I say in Sanity School is, if you can get yourself to do the exercise, do it. And again, we're doing discussion groups, so people have a place to do exactly what you're doing, where they can do the work. And I have to acknowledge, I'm one of those people that would never do it. Like, I just wouldn't do it without a structure, without somebody saying, let's do this together. I would do it with a body double, but I wouldn't do it alone.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'm excited to give everybody permission to say, look, even if you don't write it down, you write it in the Zoom chat, but we'll have opportunities to just talk about it. Right. Which is like, there's so many different ways of accessing that information. And I want to make sure I'm like, I can't wait to give everybody permission to not fill out the workbook.
I totally get that. I'm so with you. All right. So I remember the name of the author of Emotional Labor. Okay. Just got to circle back. Regina Lark, who runs a chat group out on the West Coast and is amazing.
Oh, that's great. I really appreciate that.
Just could not pull that. Sorry.
Great. I will definitely reach out. Well, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure. I was so excited to hear your personal story and your journey, but I also feel like I eked out some free parenting advice, as I couldn't help it. But really appreciate your perspective and what you and Diane are doing for parents. And as if you know, when it comes to the term complex children.
Right? You're like, you don't really have to ask, but the publisher had to ask. So, what can I do? Thank you. I really, really enjoyed it.